Okay, we're live? We're rolling? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. Hello to everyone here in Princeton. Hello to everyone at the partner locations. And hello to everyone tuning in on the live stream. So today, we're going to talk about experiments. So the schedule for today is as follows. Whoops. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to experiments. Then we're going to talk about moving beyond simple experiments, and then 4 strategies for doing experiments. We'll have a break at 10:15. Then I'll talk a little bit about zero variable cost data in Music Lab. This is a project that I did for my dissertation, and I'll talk a little bit about how I think we didn't realize it when I didn't realize it when I was doing it, but some of the ideas behind that might be helpful for designing lots of other experiments. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll have an alum of SICSS 2017, Abdullah Almaatouq, will talk about high throughput science using virtual labs. So a way of doing experiments much more quickly, which opens up a lot of new opportunities. Okay, so let's get started. So I want to briefly talk about what experiments are and how experiments are similar to they've been in the past and how they're different when you move them into a digital environment. So this is a study by Restivo and Vandereit about the impact of informal rewards on peer production. So they were interested in Wikipedia and why do people create entries on Wikipedia. So this is an example of what some social scientists call a public good, where you contribute to it and then everyone else can benefit. And so the question is, why does anyone contribute? Why doesn't everyone just wait for everyone else to contribute? So I would say that is a question. That is a puzzle if you have a certain view of human behavior. I think it's not really a puzzle if you have a different view of human behavior, but that is considered to be a puzzle. So they were interested in the role of informal peer rewards in encouraging people to contribute to public goods. So they wanted to know the effect of barn stars on contributing to Wikipedia. So barn stars are those things over there, and any Wikipedia member account can give it to any other Wikipedia account for doing something nice. So what did they do? So they looked through participants in Wikipedia, found those who are making lots of edits, and randomly gave them a barn star, and then measured the effect on future edits. So let's talk about what's the same. So this has a lot of elements that are similar to the elements that you would see in a normal experiment. So they had to recruit participants. They had to randomize to give some people a treatment and some people not. They have to deliver that treatment, and then they have to measure the outcomes subsequently. So this should all seem like what you would do in a Psych 101 lab experiment, except in this case, each of these steps was done in a fully digital way. So the recruiting participants happened through looking through the logs of Wikipedia. The randomization happened in their computer. The treatment and control were delivered, again, in a fully digital way, and the outcomes are all measured in a fully digital way. So what that means is that they actually had zero variable cost in the data. So they had 100 people in their experiment for basically the same cost. They could have had 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000. And that is what happens. Generally, the more of your experiment that runs through digital infrastructure, the lower the variable cost, the lower the cost for each additional person, which means you can run really, really large experiments. Now here, I think what's interesting about this also is that then the main limiting factor in their experiment is not cost, usually we do as many people as we can. Here, their main limiting factor was actually ethics. So if they gave out 1 million barn stars, that would fundamentally alter the ecosystem of Wikipedia, and they did not want to do that. So this also goes back to some of the issues we talked about in the first day with ethics. So giving participants barn stars, that is not likely to cause any harm to that particular person. But if you deliver a big treatment into this ecosystem, you can have a harm to the context, even if there's not a clear harm to any individual. So I want to distinguish also between two kinds of things. So people use the word experiment kind of loosely. And I want to differentiate between, like, I'm going to experiment with a new kind of pasta sauce. That means, like, I'm going to cook a sauce that I've never cooked before, and then I'm going to eat it. And I'm going to see how it is. And so that is a certain kind of experiment. You could call it some people call it perturb and observe. So you do something different, you see what happens. So I want to distinguish that from a randomized controlled experiment where we randomly assign people to conditions, give one of those a treatment, and then measure the outcome for both and compare. So when I'm talking about experiments, I really mean randomized controlled experiments. I don't mean perturb and observe experiments. Okay? So experiments are just very, very powerful. It's like a relatively simple idea to us, it seems now. This is one of my favorite quotes illustrating that power. It's like, you don't harass women, you don't steal, and you've got to have a control group. That is one of the things that you can lose your job for at Harrah's, not running a control group. So Harrah's is a casino company, and they run tons of experiments on their customers. So if you've ever been to Harrah's, you've been in experiments. So the key thing here, though, one of the things I love about this is, first, how much it's clear that they love experiments. And second, how much it's clear that for them and a lot of other people, experiments are really about the control group and not the treatment group. So a lot of times social scientists think, oh, I'm going to create a treatment and I'm going to compare that treatment to the control group. What I've noticed is that in a lot of other settings, people are already delivering treatments. And so a lot of what is required to create an experiment is to create a control group. And that is sometimes actually the harder thing, is to convince a decision maker that is so confident that they have something that is going to help the casino make more money or help kids in a school or whatever, making sure to convince them to hold back some of the people in a control. So there really are like two ways to create an experiment, sort of. One is to deliver a treatment, and one is to create space for a control condition when the treatment is going to be delivered anyway. So that's what I just said. So in the social sciences, we often think of there being a continuum between lab experiments and field experiments. So lab experiments are these Psych 101 experiments that many of you have been in. And field experiments are experiments that happen out in the world, so not in an artificial environment, in a naturally occurring environment with people other than undergrad students doing more natural tasks for real stakes. So generally, sometimes people prefer field experiments, especially non-psychologists. I think psychologists tend to prefer lab experiments, in part because with lab experiments, you are able to do much more subtle things. You're able to really like adjust the environment in a very particular way to isolate a very particular thing. And psychologists love that. Some economists love that. I think sociologists tend not to love that so much. It's okay. Basically, we can think of this as a continuum. And where you want to be on this continuum depends in part on what your research question is. So I think increasingly we're going to also see a second continuum from analog to digital. And so the question here is, how much of your experiment takes advantage of digital infrastructure? So the Van der Weydt et al. Experiment took advantage of digital infrastructure for recruiting participants, randomizing, delivering the treatment, measuring the outcomes. That's a fully digital field experiment. So that's in the upper right-hand corner. To me, that's like a particularly exciting place to be. That's the place where we're going to see stuff that we haven't seen as much before. Now, we can also have experiments that are fully digital that are more like lab experiments. So an example is the paper by Huber et al., which is basically an experiment on MTurk that is not field-like. It's a very finely, intricately tuned experiment to isolate a very particular mechanism about the way people vote. It's a very nice experiment, but it is much more like a lab experiment than a field experiment. But again, they're able to do a lot more because they can take advantage of mechanical Turk, which helps them do certain kinds of things faster and easier. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So we're on schedule. So moving beyond simple experiments. So I think you can broadly split up experiments into kind of two categories, and this is a kind of different orientation that we heard about some in Beth Novick's talk. So on the one hand, among data scientists or inside of tech companies, you often see experiments where the goal is to optimize some quantity. So for example, at Facebook, they might be trying to optimize the amount of time you spend on the site. At Spotify, they might be trying to optimize the chance that you will go from being a free customer to a subscriber. Often, the experiments that social scientists design are not designed to optimize anything. They're often designed to try to understand or pick out a particular mechanism. And so I think generally when you have one community that's doing one kind of thing and another community that's doing another kind of thing, this is sometimes creates a good opportunity. So if you tend to be in the understanding community, think, hey, what would it look like if I tried to design an experiment that was designed to optimize something? Like what kind of thing could we learn that way that people aren't asking about now? Likewise, for people who are in the communities that are doing these things to try to optimize, what are ways that if we actually understand, we can potentially optimize better? So to give an example of this, you might, let's say you worked at the New York Times and you wanted to get people to subscribe to the New York Times. So you could try a bunch of different variations of text like, please subscribe, subscribe to help the New York Times, subscribe to support the New York Times, which searches for truth, blah, blah, blah. You can imagine writing a bunch of those, doing a contextual bandit, so it's like a complicated online experiment to see which one works better. But you're not actually building any understanding in that process. And it may be the case that there is an entirely different treatment that you haven't thought of yet because you're not really understanding what's happening. So the way I like to think about it is these optimizing experiments, they can kind of get you to the top of the hill where you are. You know, if you can think of a local max. But they're very rarely going to get you to a completely different hill, and which might actually have a higher peak. So whichever of these communities that you're in, I hope you'll be able to borrow some ideas from the other community. And ideally, in the best sense, we can do experiments that are doing both of these. And that's going to be particularly true if you want to deploy your experiments inside of a company or government. You're going to want to be doing both. So a great example of an experiment that I think illustrates careful thinking about understanding and how that helps actually optimize is this paper about the constructive, destructive, and reconstructive power of social norms by Schultz. So they were interested in encouraging people to lower their energy consumption. And so what they did is they showed people their consumption relative to their efficient neighbors and relative to all of their neighbors. So how many of you actually get statements like this from your power company? Yeah, so this started, by the way, thinking of social science, this started in a paper in 2007, and the results were so impressive, companies were created to industrialize this treatment, and now it is widely deployed. So the amount of time it took from going from a paper to going to something that millions of people are receiving was actually quite short, in part because a lot of this is facilitated by digital infrastructure that the companies already have. So this is the treatment. And so if you deliver this information to people about what they're consuming and what their neighbors are consuming, and then you measure how much electricity they consume 1 week later and 3 weeks later, this is what you get. So this treatment appears to have no effect at all on how people consume their electricity. Fortunately, these researchers were more clever and more thoughtful about what might be happening. And so they had this idea that actually what looks like a null effect is actually a combination of two different effects that are offsetting each other. And so if you split this out, what you see is that people who were using more than average, they lowered their energy consumption to be closer to their peers. But people who are using more than average, and people who are using less than average actually increased their consumption. So it's like, oh, I'm using less electricity, I should start using more. Which I never would have thought people would do, but that's what they did. But these researchers were much smarter than me, and so they anticipated this, and they also created a condition where they added this smiley face here. And so basically they said, in addition, the information, they called it a descriptive norm, and the smiley face, they called it a proscriptive norm, sort of teaching people what they think is the right thing to be doing. And when you add this smiley face right here, you're able to eliminate a lot of this boomerang effect where the low energy people start to use more. And so you're able to take an experiment that seems to have no effect and you're able to turn it into something that has the effect that you want. So by thinking carefully about heterogeneity and thinking carefully about mechanisms, you're able to come up with a treatment that's actually really useful. Now, I just want to go back to this. You are not going to get this idea of the smiley faces through brute force, right? So if you were going to do an let's say some of you have done an internship at Facebook, you might think, oh, let's like change the colors on those bars. Let's change the size of that font. Like all of those things are potentially going to give you small incremental improvements. And that is true. That's great. You should want those small incremental improvements. But in this case, thinking more about heterogeneity and mechanisms allowed us to get a much bigger improvement. Okay, so if you want to move beyond these simple experiments, I think you want to think about these kind of three ideas: validity, heterogeneity of treatment effects, and mechanisms. So I talked a little bit about heterogeneity of treatment effects there. We see the same treatment has a different effect on different people as a function of their pre-existing characteristics. Mechanism is hard to define, actually, but it's kind of like the process through which the treatment leads to a certain effect. So if you were going to say limes prevent scurvy, the mechanism is vitamin C. So oftentimes we can measure that a treatment has an effect without understanding the mechanism. But ideally, if we understand the mechanism, then we can sometimes like amp up that mechanism and design treatments that really focus on that mechanism even more. So validity, I think of validity as a useful kind of checklist to think about what a result is and communicate your concerns. And as you're designing your own experiments, think about how you can address each of these concerns. So statistical conclusion validity is like, did you do your statistics correctly? Internal validity is like, did the randomization work correctly? Was a treatment delivered correctly? These can actually be real problems in online experiments. Those are very, very easy to mess up. And so if you're evaluating an online experiment, if it has 50 million people in it, if they screwed up the randomization or people in the control group got the treatment, it doesn't matter that there's 50 million people in it. It's a messed up experiment. Construct validity is an important idea of often when we create, like in this case, their thinking was about descriptive norms and proscriptive norms. And the treatment is this. So like, is the treatment really operationalizing your theoretical construct? This is often very hard to do. This makes the most sense in these kinds of understanding experiments. So if you're just trying to like find the shade of blue that maximizes click-throughs, there's no real issue with construct validity. But if you're trying to have an experiment that's designed to yield understanding, you have to make sure that what you're doing and your theories are linked together correctly. So one thing I like to do is always go back and forth between these two views. So sometimes I try to only think about it abstractly, and then other times I like to think about it only what the person actually did. And if what the person says they did abstractly and what the person actually did feel really different, then that's like a sign to me that there's some kind of construct validity problem. External validity is also very hard to define well, but it often means that people think that the results might not be the same if you did it somewhere else with different people in a different setting. This often, I've seen people debate about this in rooms without any evidence. And I think one of the great things about these digital experiments is that you can just do it. External validity is an empirical question, not a question that a reviewer should just speculate about. And so like, let's just do the experiment with different people or in a different setting and see what happens. And if the cost of experiments comes way down, then it's much easier to do that. So heterogeneous treatment effects. So in experiments, in digital experiments, there are often many more people than there are in lab experiments. And we often have lots of pre-treatment information about those people. So if you think about Facebook, if you're running an experiment on Facebook, you know tons of information about those people. And so the traditional lab experiments tend to treat people like widgets. They just treat them all as indistinguishable. And if you have lots of people and lots of pre-treatment information, you don't want to treat people like widgets. It's just wasting information. And you're potentially missing important and interesting scientific findings. Just to be clear, heterogeneity of treatment effects is also an area where you can have phishing and p-hacking. So you can like look through your experiment and say, oh, it worked well for men. Did it work well for men and not women? Oh, did it work well for 18 to 24-year-old men or whatever? So you want to think about some of the things Justin Grimmer talked about, a pre-analysis plan or splitting up a training set and a test set. And there are lots of new methods being developed to work in this. Justin Grimmer, for example, has some methods in this area. There are others as well. So mechanisms is the last idea. It's not as easy. I said, oh, it's like scurvy and Lyme's, and the mechanism is vitamin C. And for those of you who have actually tried to isolate a mechanism, you know it's not that easy. I think this paper by Don Green and colleagues does a great job of illustrating why it's not that easy. So I just want to say mechanisms are important, but they are hard. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do that. There are now experimental designs specifically designed to test mechanisms. I see some smiles. This is not, I don't mean to suggest that this is a solution to the problem. This is at the minimum, it's a step forward and a clarification of what some of the issues are, I think. So again, I think if you focus on mechanisms, if you focus particularly on mechanisms and heterogeneity of treatment effects, those are areas where optimizing experiments and understanding experiments share goals. And so if you can see those kinds of problems, then you will potentially be able to partner with companies and governments, which will allow you to run experiments that you could not run otherwise. So are there any questions about moving beyond simple experiments? Jared. Oh, great. Tom, can we pass the mic?
How important is it to use pre-treatment information? The idea that I'm familiar with in experimental design is if you randomize successfully, you actually don't need to know anything about the people because the difference will presumably be due to the condition.
That's true. So if you randomize successfully, you don't need to know anything about the people. If you have that pre-treatment information, though, you can do something called blocking, which allows you to be able to randomize better than random. So sort of somewhat in the same way that I had you all raise your hand if you had ever done an experiment on MTurk, and then we counted off and raise your hand if you've ever done a survey. And that made sure that each of the teams were more similar in composition than might happen randomly. Basically, blocking allows you to potentially remove some bad assignments where there's imbalance. And then second is, even if the groups are balanced, it's sometimes the case that you might want to know, let's ignore the problems of overfishing for a second. Let's say I could tell you, you run a big experiment and then you automatically find the subgroups where the treatment effect is the biggest and the treatment effect is the smallest. That would be cool. And you could do that even if you do simple random sampling, right? So I think the pretreatment information is helpful for one, in the design stage in terms of blocking, and two, in the analysis stage in terms of finding interesting heterogeneity, given that you're careful about the fishing problem.
So is it true that like blocked randomization is very similar to like stratified random sampling and survey design?
Yep, exactly.
Got it.
Can you give an example? So usually when you're in experiments in social sciences, we're trying to develop understanding. Can you give an example of how to pull more from optimization and designing social science experiments?
It's hard. So I guess what I would say is, I don't have a ton of great examples, but let me try to illustrate, give some hypothetical ideas. So if I was very interested in, let's say, the effect of fear on people's attitudes towards immigration or something like that, I could imagine trying to find hundreds of different stimuli and trying to say, I want to find the stimuli that creates the most fear for a given person so that I can find a treatment effect as big as I can. So that's like more in the, I guess that would be more in the design stage of the experiment. Like as you think about setting something up, finding stimuli that are allow you to probe the thing that you want to probe. I think it could also be in terms of how you frame your question. So let's go back to the descriptive, proscriptive norms and energy question. So as a researcher, you could start off by saying, I want to study descriptive and proscriptive norms. Or you could start off saying, I want to reduce people's energy consumption. And I guess what I'm speculating is that if you say, I want to reduce people's energy consumption, that's going to lead you down a different road. And that road could turn out to be fruitful for revealing new kinds of mechanisms or approaching existing mechanisms in new ways. But that's purely a speculation.
Hi, I'm thinking about external validity, so I feel like you might be a bit blasé about this. So
Yes?
my Twitter bot experiments that we talked about earlier.
Yes?
I've tried to replicate them.
Yep.
And it's not possible in the sense that Twitter is now different. It
Yep.
will suspend your accounts if you try to do it. So I was wondering what you think about how we should think about digital experiments on platforms that can change in infinitely many ways that we can't measure.
Yep. So I like the stuff you're doing about like validity and time. I don't remember what you call it. Temporal validity. So one of the things I like to do in any online experiment is I think it should say exactly the dates that the data is collected. Like a very simple thing, like when exactly did this happen? Because if you say, oh, I did an experiment on Twitter and I published a paper in 2019, like Twitter in 2018 and Twitter in 2017 are actually pretty different. And Twitter in 2018 and 2013 are really different. And so I think at a minimum what you want to do is say exactly when the data collection happened. And more generally, I think it's great for us to see to what extent we can run the same thing over time in the same platform. Sometimes the platform itself, the rules of the platform stay the same. So you could do it, but the norms in the platform change. So the effects might change. I think that's interesting. Yep.
This isn't so much a question as just information sharing, and I'm sure there are lots of people who've done experiments, so they already know this, but sometimes when we're like using MTurkers, for instance, we might not have their pre-treatment variables ahead of time, so we collect that information. And it's really important to think about when you collect that information when you're doing an experiment. And so if you're doing social science research, sometimes, especially if it's about attitudes, you know, even if it's not, I don't know, but if it's about attitudes, you might actually end up affecting some of your pre-treatment variables, what people say. And so I ran into this problem when I was piloting my study, and I collected all of my demographic information after my participants had been exposed to various messages about immigrants. And I realized that in certain conditions, I was having like lower than expected Republicans versus independents. And what became obvious was that my prime was changing these like independents, Republicans to identify as Republican or identify as independent because some things aren't that stable. Political identification is actually kind of movable depending on the thing that you're talking about. So then I had to realize, well, I have to put some of my demographic questions up front so that I can control on that later, because if it's after the prime, then I have to now take into consideration that my prime might have actually affected what they said about themselves. And I'm not the only person who's run into this issue. Other researchers have also encountered things like that. So being really careful about your placement of your demographic questions and how even your demographic questions could affect your treatment, right? So I didn't put my race questions up front because I'm interested in racial attitudes. And so that goes to the back because people aren't really changing their racial identification, for instance, but they might change like how liberal or conservative they think that they are. So just keeping that in mind in research design.
So yeah, so if you put your question, the demographics at the beginning, there's a possible problem. If you put the demographics at the end, there's a possible problem. I'm wondering if people have experience of not putting the demographics in at all and somehow linking that information from other data sources. So for example, if you see the same Turkers over and over and over again, you don't need to collect that information every time. Or if you could somehow link them to their information in Facebook or some other platform. Have people done that? Has anyone done that? Oh, good. Okay, so if you're interested in talking about getting demographics for people on these Turk-like platforms, maybe that's a good thing to talk about at the coffee break. Yep, Jay?
I have a question about externality and also causal mechanism, like mediation or moderation. So to me, there's a kind of collective action problem in social sciences, maybe only in political science. So problem for externality is like you need to have multiple study, not only one study. Like if you have just single shot and from one period, one population, it's kind of how to say generalize your findings. So you need to do a follow-up study. And for the same problem for the causal mechanism, if you want to do moderation or mediation, you need to have a large enough population size. Otherwise, if you're just subsetting data, it's kind of hard to get power for doing analysis. So one way you can solve the problem is like if you have same interest among the different groups of researchers, you can put together your resources and time and doing multiple study for the same project and publishing a paper saying like there are 10 studies duplicating the same finding or different locations, different time. And we have like a large data set, so we can do multiple kind of things, moderation, mediation, and so on. But sometimes I see some papers doing that, but like it's not kind of very widespread phenomena and it's in political science. So I wonder, I mean, I think it's kind of good model, but somehow it's not, doesn't scale up. So I wonder what's the reason for that? Or why you think it's not working? Well, it's not a good model.
Oh, so I agree with you that, we really want to see the same experiment run multiple times or slight variations of it run multiple times. I think why the team model doesn't work very well is that it's very hard to do. So having organized a mass collaboration, I can tell you that it's a lot of work, and it's not the work that we usually think of ourselves as doing. But I would encourage us to think that our job is not to write as many papers as possible, but it's to learn as much as possible. And so if this is the design that allows us to learn as much as possible, then maybe that is how we should think about what we should be doing. I think one other solution to this problem, other than collaborating with many different teams of scientists, which I think for a variety of reasons is hard, is potentially teaming up with a company which allows you to deploy at a much larger scale. So after the experiment about the norms and the power usage, so this company called O-Power started deploying that experiment at a massive scale, and an economist named Hunt Alcott, and maybe some other people too, teamed up with this company, O-Power, and so they ran that experiment that you saw, they ran it like 100 times in a bunch of different cities, in a bunch of different years, and so they were able to find some very interesting stuff about this sort of, you could call it the external validity of the finding, or I would call it the heterogeneity of the finding. So just to give an example, one thing they found was that as time went on, the size of the effect got smaller. And so that you might think that has something to do with people's changing attitudes about the environment, but they actually think it had to do with which power companies deployed this experiment first. So power companies in areas where there are a lot of consumers that are concerned about the environment were some of the first companies to adopt this particular treatment, and so they got a larger effect. And as the treatment got moved out towards places where consumers were less concerned about energy, the size went away. So I think that's like a great example of seeing, often when researchers try to do their first field experiment, they try to pick a setting where it will work. Like, I don't know of any researcher who's about to deploy a big, expensive, complicated field experiment who is not thinking, where is the place that this experiment is most likely to be successful? I mean, if you know of someone who's not thought that, please let me know. And so then I think any first paper is likely to be a kind of high estimate if you think of the set of all possible settings where something could be deployed. Because the researcher often knows the most, or has the best idea of where it will be successful. So I think, again, by partnering with companies, I think we can see lots of replications, or by partnering with lots of other academics, and it's a question of kind of for certain kinds of problems, one of those approaches will probably be easier. Okay, so let's move on to the last set of slides before the break. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to actually do experiments, sort of different ways to think about approaches to experiments. So we've talked a lot about working with companies. One of the questions that sometimes people ask me is like, well, I don't work at Facebook. I can't run an online experiment. And I think that's just not right. So I think, in fact, there are people in this room who have shown that you can very creatively run online experiments without the cooperation of the large tech companies. So I want to talk about a couple different ways you can think about doing experiments and what are the trade-offs between these different approaches. So I think the main dimensions of the trade-offs are cost, control being the experimental control that you have, realism, and ethics. And so I think basically one strategy is what I called partner with the powerful. So this would be working with companies or governments, so the things that Beth Novick talked about, for example. This often has a low cost to you because the company has already built all the infrastructure that they need to do these. You sometimes have a decent amount of control over the treatment, other times you can't. So there are certain treatments that Facebook has the capability of running, but would never let you. The realism is high, and then the ethics are potentially complicated. How should you partner with the powerful? So first, you have to think of it as a partnership. So I've heard people come to me and say, oh, I want the New York Times to give me all of their data. And I'm like, well, I can tell you that's not going to happen. Like, If you say, I want to partner with the New York Times to work on a project together, that's a very different way to begin a conversation. So if you begin with, give me your data, that's not likely to be successful. If you begin with, I want to run my experiment, not likely to be successful. So think about how you can partner. There are a lot of personal relationships involved. So Landra Nelson talked about how we can make access to data more democratic and open to everyone. I think in terms of partnering with people at companies, it's hard for me, for experiments, it's hard for me to imagine a mechanism like Social Science 1 where everyone can apply and so on. I think there's a lot of trust involved and building personal relationships through things like internships or meeting people at conferences. I don't have any great advice for how to do this. The best, I guess the most concrete thing I could say is do internships. So most of these companies have internship programs. They want to hire people just like you. And so doing an internship is a great way to learn. You will get exposed to lots of new stuff. It's a great learning experience. You'll pick up skills that you don't pick up in your university. And it's a great way to form partnerships where you could do research both while you're an intern and potentially afterwards. And then last thing I want to talk about is Pastore's Quadrant. This is also came up in Beth's talk. So at a company, most of what they're going to do, so let's go back for 1 second. So people sometimes think there's a distinction between pure research and applied research. And a great counterexample to this one-dimensional thinking is Pasteur. So his work that led to the germ theory of disease, which is naturally as pure research as you could imagine, was motivated in part by his work trying to convert beet juice into alcohol at a factory. And the stuff kept blowing up in the factory. And he said, I wonder why this reaction is not working well. There must be some other thing here that I'm not able to see with my eyes that's causing this. So that was both motivated by use, so turning beet juice into alcohol, and seeking fundamental understanding. And so those are the kinds of projects that I think are best for partnering with the powerful. There has to be a consideration of use. If you go to a company and say, I want to do this cool thing to study this mechanism that psychologists are really interested in, it's just, I don't think that's likely to be very effective. But if you say, I want to help you achieve your goals, and simultaneously, we're going to be able to advance science, they'll generally, I think, be much more open. But you don't have to partner with the powerful. You can just do it yourself. So one is use existing systems. So the cost is often low. The control is low because you have to sort of hijack what these systems allow. The realism can be high and the ethics can be complex. So the experiment that we saw with Wikipedia, they just used existing things on Wikipedia, and that allowed them to run these experiments. Kevin has done some stuff on Twitter where he took advantage of the capabilities that Twitter had to just sort of run an experiment on top of Twitter without the cooperation of people inside of the company. Generally, the types of things you can do are much more narrow if you're not behind the scenes moving things around. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done in this space. So here's an example that I like. This paper is called The Visible Hand. And so what they did is they measured the effect of race on a bunch of things about selling these iPad minis on Craigslist. So basically, they took advantage of the infrastructure of Craigslist and ran all of these ads and tried to measure the effect of the race of the seller, or whether the seller had a tattoo or not. Did not require any cooperation with Craigslist. So again, I think there's lots of opportunities to use digital platforms without having to work with them directly. You could build your own experiment. The cost here is medium. The control is high because you're building it yourself. The realism can be medium, and the ethics are relatively easy. An example of this is the Music Lab experiment, which I'll talk to you about after the coffee break. And then the last thing is building a product. So I think this is very, very hard. It's very expensive. but you get a lot of control and a lot of realism. And so the example here is Movie Lens. They built a service to do movie recommendations, and this is such a good service that people use it. And so it is essentially a product. It is competing against other products, but it enables research. So I want to say this idea of building a product that then becomes a platform for your research, you can imagine this kind of cycle like I talked about with all their ideas. So this, if you can do this, this is magical, right? You don't need to push the boulder up the hill over and over and over again. You've pushed the boulder and each experiment gets easier and easier and easier because you have a big user base, you have a lot of infrastructure. This is extremely hard. I don't know of many examples where this is successful. And Movie Lens is maybe the only one, and Movie Lens is, I think, struggling now because a lot of recommendations have been taken into other platforms. So that's kind of a range of different approaches. None of these approaches dominate any of the other approaches. There's trade-offs involved in all of them. But I think the most important idea is if you want to partner with the powerful, you need to have a partner. You need to have a reason to be a partner. And then if you want to do it, and the second most important thing is you don't need to partner with the powerful. You can do it yourself using a variety of different strategies. So are there any questions? Nick?
In terms of partnering with the powerful, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about collaborative partnerships versus like transactional partnerships, ones that are ongoing versus just for the duration project, and just kind of the different forms that might take.
Yeah. So I think good partnerships probably take a long time to develop. And also at the beginning, it's often hard to know where they're going to go at the end. So I think like when you're developing a piece of software, there's like this one kind of model called like waterfall where you plan everything out in advance and you say like in week 2, we're going to do this. In week 3, we're going to do this. In week 10, we're going to do this. And then it's fully spec'd out at the beginning. I think that is almost impossible for your partner at the company to be able to do unless you know what their capabilities are really well and they know what your capabilities are really well. So I think much more it's going to be iterative and it's going to be hard to know at the beginning where it's going to go at the end, which I think is why a lot of these things don't work. I will say one piece of advice that I have for you all thinking about doing these partnerships is to remember that you all have a lot to contribute and you all have scarce skills and resources that they need. So I remember when I was in grad school, I met with someone from a company and he like took me out to lunch and I thought that was like the greatest thing. I was like, wow, you're taking me out to lunch? This is great. And so we talked and he asked me a bunch of questions and I was trying to help. And then he's like, okay, great, let's have lunch again. And he's like, yeah, we'll give you whatever data you need. We'll give you, and they're like, let's have lunch. So we had another lunch and it was like another consulting session. And then I was like, what? He hasn't really given me any data yet. Is he ever going to give me this data? So I asked around and someone was like, okay, what you should do is say, before our next lunch, please send me a file layout of exactly what is in your database and full technical specifications of what you have. And then once I can see that, then we can have lunch again. And so we never had lunch again. But so one way to, so what I learned from this experience is one, we do have a lot to value. So he was very happy to pay $15 to have an hour of free consulting. And two, you want to try to ask for some sign of commitment at the beginning. And it doesn't have to be big. So if they're not able to do some very basic thing for you, then that's a sign that they're probably not going to be willing or able to do a complicated thing in the future. So sometimes it's hard to tell if they're able to even do what they say or willing. And in some sense it matters, but in some sense it doesn't matter. So I like to now, going forward, ask for like a clear sign of willingness and capability at the beginning. Other questions? All right, so let's have a coffee break. We are only 5 minutes behind schedule, so we're gonna have a 10-minute coffee break. We'll come back here at 10:15 to continue hearing about experiments. Oh no, I'm just kidding. We are ahead of schedule. So you have a coffee break until 10:30. Enjoy. So, welcome back, everyone. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to everyone here and on the live stream and at the partner locations. What we're going to do now is talk a little bit more about zero variable cost experiments and Music Lab. This is an experiment that I worked on. Then we'll have a coffee break and we'll have our guest speaker. So this talk is really about experiments at scale. So what is possible to do when you really increase what you're doing by a factor of 10 or 100 or 1,000. So you sometimes hear people take any word and put at scale at the end and act like it's a new thing. And sometimes I think that's a little silly, especially because I'm on the East Coast. So if I lived on the West Coast, then I would naturally do that all the time. But on the East Coast, we don't talk about scale so much. However, I do think there is something really different about doing, if you can increase the scale by a factor of 100, it really requires a new kind of thinking. Don't think about what you've done before and doing that just 100 times. Try to think of doing something different. And so what I want to do a little bit now is teach you about how to think about enabling that scale, and then I want to teach you a little bit about how to be careful with that scale, like, and how to use that capability responsibly. So this is a picture that I think is super important, and it's one that you'll see in a lot of parts of computational social science, not just experiments. It's thinking about how the cost of some research project scales as the number of participants increases. So you see for an experiment, there's a small amount of startup cost. This might be this fixed cost is like having space for a lab or things like that. And then for each participant, the costs go up by a fixed amount. So if you want to double your number of participants, you need to roughly double your cost. If you want to increase your participants by a factor of 10, you roughly need to increase your cost by a factor of 10. So this makes really large experiments very difficult. A lot of digital experiments have a very different cost structure, which is they have very high fixed cost, and then they have almost zero variable cost. So this means that for a lot of relatively small experiments, sometimes these digital techniques are not really worth it. You're not going to see a huge amount of gain in terms of cost savings. But for certain kinds of numbers of participation, for certain types of experiments, really the only way to do it is by going to a more digital system with this different cost scaling. So how is it that you can get this cost curve with zero variable cost? How do you think about designing an experiment to allow that? So you have to think about what are the main sources of variable cost, and usually those are two. One is staff time, and one is participant payment. So staff time is often like if you're running a lab experiment, they're usually grad students or undergrads in the lab manning that study. Those people have to be paid. And participant payment is for the people who are in the study. You need to give them some kind of compensation. It could be money, it could be chocolate, it could be anything, but it's usually something of value. So if you want to eliminate those sources of variable cost, you want to do automation to eliminate your staff time, and you want to design enjoyable experiments so that the participant payment costs you nothing. So I want to talk briefly about automation. How do you know if you've automated your experiment sufficiently? So a good rule of thumb is it should be able to run while you are asleep. So during the Music Lab experiment, it would run while I was sleeping, and that was awesome. So I would like literally get up in the morning, go to the lab, go to the office, run an SQL command, and see how many people had been in the experiment while I was asleep. So if you can do that, you're going to be able to do a lot of things that are hard to do otherwise. So neither of these things is easy. It's not easy to fully automate the experiment, and it's not easy to design enjoyable experiments, but I think we can do a better job of these things I think a lot of the way we think about designing experiments comes from a different era, and if we adjust to this newer era, we can design different kinds of experiments. So I want to talk a little bit about Music Lab. So this was the study that we did. This was my dissertation. My advisor was Duncan Watts, and then this first paper was co-authored also with Peter Dodds. So we built this website, and the website was built by Peter Housel, who was a software engineer in our group. We built this website where people could come and download new music. They were presented with a list of 48 songs. Actually, let me talk a little bit about what the motivation for this experiment was before I talk about the plumbing of the experiment. So it was really motivated by things like Harry Potter. So Harry Potter, as we all know, was an incredibly successful book, sold millions of copies around the world, translated into more than 60 languages. So that incredible success might make you think that Harry Potter was somehow better than all other books. Or if not better, at least different than all other books. But yet, Harry Potter was rejected by 8 different publishers before it was finally picked up. And it seems like a strange combination that something that went on to become so successful was so hard to distinguish ahead of time. And it turns out that this is not specific to Harry Potter. I could have told you similar stories about hit TV shows like American Idol or movies like Star Wars. And in fact, there's a general pattern in the market for books, movies, music, works of art, and TV shows where we see 2 things simultaneously. One is huge variation in success. These are sometimes called winner-take-all markets or superstar markets. And at the same time, tremendous unpredictability of success. So which things will go on to become the superstars is very hard to predict, even for people whose only job it is to predict those things. And so this makes you wonder why we see these 2 things together that seem to be somewhat contradictory. And so what we argue is that both of these collective level patterns arise from the same individual level process of social influence. So if people are influenced by what other people are doing, you can imagine how that leads to a process of cumulative advantage, which leads to these superstars. Also, if people are influenced by what other people are doing, these kinds of popularity snowballs could form very differently depending on small differences at the beginning of the process. So imagine if we could rewind the world to the day that Harry Potter was first released and make 8 copies of the world and have them all evolve independently. So the question would be, would Harry Potter be popular in all 8 worlds, or it would be popular in one and not the others? So if it was indeed popular in all 8 worlds, then we would know that Harry Potter is good. We would have to believe that evidence. That's pretty strong evidence. But if Harry Potter was popular in one but not the others, then we might know that it's lucky. And so the challenge is that we only get to see one copy of the world. And it's very hard to know from this one copy what can be attributed to the skill of, or the characteristics of Harry Potter, and what should be attributed to just chance. It's like imagine you just see a roulette wheel roll once. You don't know if the same thing is going to happen each time or a different thing is going to happen. And so we can't take the world and rewind it and make these parallel copies. But we can create these sort of parallel histories online. So we created this website where people could come and download new music, and then we're able to create these parallel histories and see to what extent they evolve similarly or to what extent they evolve differently. So this is the website. People were presented with a list of 48 songs by up-and-coming but unknown artists. So that's an important part of this. So if there was up here Britney Spears or Justin Timberlake, who were popular around this time, people would already come into the experiment with lots of ideas about those people. So these are all bands that people had never heard of, or were very low popularity, but also hopefully high quality. And then the only information you have about them is the name of the song, the name of the band, and then the number of times that song had been downloaded. And those are real download counts that had been generated by prior participants in the experiment. So you click on a song, you have a chance to listen to it. It begins to stream. and you get a chance to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Then afterwards, you have a chance to download the song. So in the way we set up the experiment, we tried to encourage people to think that we were very interested in this rating decision, but actually what we were very interested in was the decision to download it or not. And then you're back here and you could listen to as many songs as you wanted. So behind the scenes, what the subjects did not see was that they were randomly assigned to these conditions. So to be clear, they did know they were in an experiment. They did fill out a consent form. We actually very explicitly made it look like an experiment. We put Columbia University really big. We put music lab, like the lab part was really big, because in this particular setting, we thought that the fact that it was a scientific study added legitimacy to it. Around this time, speaking of temporal validity, downloading music was like a little bit of a gray area because of Napster, and there's a lot of illegal downloading happening. And so we thought this added a lot of credibility to say, we put the Columbia crown on there. So anyway, what participants did not know is they were randomly assigned into either a social influence condition, which is what you saw, or an independent condition. So that was just like what you saw, but there was no information about the popularity. So this allows us to see what happens when people are acting independently. And then second, in the social influence condition, we split people into one of these 8 parallel worlds. So you could think of this as like putting people in a room, and you can see what other people in your room have done, but not what people in the other rooms have done. And so then we can see to what extent these worlds, which have the same initial conditions, the exact same songs, and indistinguishable participants because of the random assignment, to what extent these worlds evolve different outcomes. And then we can compare those to the independent condition to see what's the effect of social influence on the shape of the popularity distribution. So we ran 2 versions of this. One, the version on your left with less social influence, and then the version on the right with more social influence. So the difference is, in one case, the songs are sorted by popularity in a single column. So in both cases, the information about popularity is available, but in the second experiment, it's much more salient. And so you can see through this change in the interface, we're able to manipulate an individual level of process and make it stronger. And then the question is that going to have the effects that we predict at the aggregate level? So, so let's see what happened. So here are the results. So the x-axis here is the market share in the independent world. And we talk about that as a measure of the appeal of the song to this group of participants. So we say, if lots of people acting independently download this song, that means these people like this song. The y-axis is the market share in the social influence world. So the market share is the number of downloads for this song divided by the total number of downloads. And so I want to emphasize 2 patterns. Let's start first with experiment 2. So what you see is that as the market share in the independent world increases, that's the appeal of the songs, the range, let me just say one more thing. So for each song, there are 8 points on the y-axis. So the highest appeal song in experiment 2, I believe, was She Said by Parker Theory. And so there are 8 points on the y-axis for that one song. And that's the market share of She Said by Parker Theory in each of the 8 worlds. So what you see, a couple of things. The first pattern you see is that for any given song, a range of outcomes are possible. Sometimes that can be quite big. So we had one song, in one world, this song came in first. In another world, it came in 40th out of 48. This is exactly the same song competing against exactly the same other songs. Lisa?
So can you guess what was between 1 and 2?
The question was, what's experiment 1 and what's experiment 2? Yes. So experiment 1 is the one with less social influence, and experiment 2 is the one with more social influence. So what happens is when we increase the amount of social influence, we get more unpredictability. The range of possible outcomes for these songs increases. So you can see the one way to measure the unpredictability is for any given song to look at how much, if we randomly choose a song and we randomly choose 2 worlds, how different are they going to be? That's a measure of the unpredictability. And that unpredictability cannot be resolved by knowing more about the song. Because this is, again, exactly the same song, and you can see a range of outcomes are possible. I want to call also your attention to the shape of the points in experiment 2. It looks like kind of like a cone. It like opens up as the quality increases. So while I was working on my dissertation, I got to meet with someone who was the head of research for NBC. This is a major media company in the US. And I was telling him about this experiment, and he looked at experiment 2 and he said, oh, I already knew that. And I was like, great, what did you know? And he said, well, I can predict failure, but I can't predict success. So I think that was a beautiful summary of that pattern. So for the songs with low appeal, they always do poorly, but as the appeal increases, the variability also increases. So you'll notice that I talk about unpredictability a lot, but it's not the case that these results are purely random. So if you average the success across the 8 worlds, you end up with something that's correlated with the appeal. You can predict failure, but you can't predict success. So that's a very small amount about what we learned from the experiment. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the design of the experiment and how it relates to zero variable cost. So imagine that instead of, what was the incentive for people in this experiment? It was for them to download free music. So that was great because that is actually the thing that we were studying. And that incentive also has zero variable cost. So there was a fixed cost in getting the music because we had to contact the bands and get their permission. But once we had their permission, we could run as many people as we wanted through this without any additional cost. So if we had been paying people instead of giving them free music, we wouldn't have had the good cost scaling that we did. So I want to emphasize also that zero variable cost is a means and not an end. So you don't want to think about zero variable cost just to do zero variable cost. You want to think about zero variable cost for what kinds of research it enables. And so in this case, like, the unit of analysis we were interested in was the sort of collective history. So those required like 700, each one of these data points was generated by about 700 people. So in total, we did 4 experiments, and so we had 27,000 people. And this was only possible because of this zero variable cost. And doing the experiments where the group outcome is the unit of analysis requires this kind of large number of participants. So let me try to explain that a little bit more. So sometimes people ask me like, well, what is sociology? And I'm sure some of you have had this question. Yeah, so what I usually say is, so in the same way that psychology is a study of individuals, sociology is a study of groups. And there are certain things that happen when you have groups of people that don't happen when you have individual people. And so it's kind of like the difference between studying a dog and studying a pack of dogs. And so there are certain things about packs of dogs you can't study just from an individual dog. Or the difference between juries and jury members. And so if you want to study juries and not jury members, then you need many juries. You need many groups. And so then you very quickly need very, very large numbers of participants to do experimental work. So in sociology, experimental work is not very common. And I think part of that is because we are often interested in group dynamics, and group dynamics are hard to study experimentally unless you have very large numbers of participants, and that used to be very difficult in the past. And I think that is becoming less difficult in the future. And as you'll hear about from Abdullah, it's becoming less difficult than it was yesterday even. Like, he's actively working to make it much, much easier in the future. So it's a means to an end. The end is studying group dynamics. It's not something you want to do just for itself. Are there any questions about how we set up the study or anything like that that people want to hear about? Yeah?
Kartik from the Boston location wanted to know how long the experiment ran for.
So in the paper, we report the exact dates because I was concerned about temporal validity. The answer is experiments 1 and 2 ran for roughly 3 months. And then there were 2 more experiments, which I didn't tell you about, that ran for also about 3 months. The key thing that determined how long they ran was how many participants we could recruit. So I didn't say how we recruited the participants. So we recruited them in experiments 1 and 2. There were ads on a website called bolt.com, which was like, is kind of like a early version of Facebook. And they wanted to be friends with my advisor, or my advisor wanted to be friends with them. I don't know, there was a collaboration sort of. And they had leftover ad impressions. They had not sold all their ad impressions. And so whenever they had leftover ad impressions, they would run our ads. And so through that, we were able to recruit 14,000 people, mostly American teenagers. And that 14,000 recruitment is actual registered. So we had many more people come and then not register. So I think when people think about recruiting participants, they often think, oh, let's just go to MTurk. But at the same time, we now have the capability to put ads anywhere on the web and recruit very different kinds of participants if we want to think about. So for example, you could run ads on the New York Times and recruit a bunch of people. Then you could run ads on the Wall Street Journal and recruit a bunch of people and see if you get the same kinds of results. You could run ads on Breitbart and see if you get the same kinds of results. So this capability, I think, of using ads to recruit people is one I don't see utilized very often. And our ability to target very specific populations with ads will only improve. So the length of time that we were able to recruit participants is what determines kind of how long they ran. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Tom.
Just trying to understand the motivations of the participants. Like, are they really trying to go to the experiment to download the popular music that is already in the market? Like, just they don't want to download it free by payment, so they come to your experiment and download it.
Yeah, so what are the participants doing here? It's a good question. So I think what they were doing is a mixture of things. So one is they were looking to discover new music. And so they were not, when they participated, we told them this is going to be new music from up and coming artists. So I think these are people who are more inclined to want to discover new music. Also, we told them that this was a scientific study. And so some of the people were particularly interested in helping science. So there was also a big difference between experiments 1 and 2 used mostly these American teenagers that were recruited with ads. Experiments 3 and 4 used a very different population. So they were people who had participated in an earlier online experiment that my colleagues had done called the Electronic Small World Experiment. And so we had about 100,000 email addresses from that. And we emailed those people. And those people were older and more international and were people who had been in a previous scientific study and chose to respond to an email to ask them to be in a different scientific study. And so that was actually useful that these populations were somewhat different because we saw, for example, in experiments 3 and 4, people would listen to more songs on average than the people in experiment 1 and 2. So that's like a parameter that determines the results that we did not control. That was controlled by the participants. So having participants who do kinds of different search behavior is important to see how robust these results are. So we found, for example, that the appeal of the songs in experiments 3 and 4 was different than in experiments 1 and 2. Like the older people liked different music than the younger people. But the overall shape of the popularity distributions were similar and the overall amount of unpredictability was similar. but which particular song was in which particular slot was different. Yep.
I think there are also some interesting questions like how the recommendation systems or like micro-targeting shapes the collective taste of like music, or I think there are some studies on Spotify or like similar things. Like, do you know like what are the consensus and what are some open questions in these fields?
Sure. I think you're right that this has a lot of implications for recommendation systems. My sense is that it's very important for you to decide what the goal of the recommendation system is. And so one goal of the recommendation system would be that songs that are better, the popularity of the songs should be matched to their quality. That's like a goal of justice. A different goal is that people should be more likely to enjoy the songs that they listen to. And those two are actually quite different. So in experiment 2, I believe it's the case that people are more likely to download the songs that they listen to. But the relationship between popularity and success is actually weaker. So when you focus people's attention on a subset of the songs that are at the top are usually pretty good. And so if your goal is just to make sure people get exposed to good songs, then allowing these kinds of popularity snowballs and attention focusing is not necessarily a bad thing. But if your goal is to have a system that it's as fair as possible, then I think you want to, as much as possible, separate the popularity from what people actually, you want to separate seeing what's popular from actually engaging with the content. And I know there are a number of open questions about this for recommendation systems.
I actually had a quick question, which was, when you did this experiment, did you find that you had the fat head, long tail, or whatever it was, skinny tail as well? So there's a bunch of users who were using it a lot, and a couple of people who just came in for a couple of songs?
Yes, so definitely there's a distribution in the number of listens per session, for sure, and the number of downloads per session. There are some people, especially the older people, who downloaded all the songs. And not that many, but a few. So yeah, we did see variation in behavior. And that, again, is kind of allowed because we're not really controlling what people do when they get here. So that also illustrates another key parameter that we fixed is the number of songs. So ideally, I would have liked to have had 48,000 songs, not 48, because I think that is a key element of the markets that we talked about, which is choice overload. There's just too many songs, movies, music, books, all these things. We ended up with 48 because that was the most that we could fit on one screen without scrolling. But you can imagine increasing the number of songs. You could also imagine changing the distribution of appeal of the songs. So if the songs were more similar in appeal, I think these effects might have been bigger. If there were some songs that really stood out from the others, I think the effects might have been smaller. So that distribution of appeal is another key system parameter that in this case was set by the place that we sampled the music from, not by some choice that we explicitly made. Yeah, Tom?
All right, so Chris from Mexico asks, how many different music genres did you add in the experiment? Because if you had, for example, 10 rock songs and 5 pop songs, it's possible that this may bias the results given the music preferences of the population.
Yep. So the answer is the distribution of genres was determined by the website that we sampled from. So we sampled the music from this website called purevolume.com. So there are a mix of genres. But one thing I want to clarify is this. So we don't make any statements about the quality of these songs in some kind of absolute sense, because I don't think that really exists. So like if you like Britney Spears and well, let's say I like Britney Spears and you like Beethoven, you might say Beethoven is better than Britney Spears, but like, what if I say Britney Spears is better than Beethoven? Like, yeah. That could be. So what we like to do is we like to think about think that basically people like stuff. People like some stuff. Some people like other stuff. That's okay. And so what we are able to do is, because our participants are randomly assigned into the independent condition, we have a measure of the appeal of these songs to these participants. And then we have a measure of what their success is for indistinguishable participants. So I think this is one of the aspects of the design that I think was really helpful, is that prior research in this area had tried to measure the quality of the artistic products by critical reviews or other kinds of things like that. And there's always the concern that these measures of quality aren't the right measures of quality. And so here we say, we're not going to measure the quality, we're just going to measure how much these people like it. Okay, next. Okay. Victoria?
Anyhow, when you published on this work, did you also publish like descriptive things, or did you only publish on like causal things?
We published descriptive things like who was in the experiment and stuff like that. But the main thing we were interested in was these comparisons across conditions.
I have a question about mechanism. So what I found that, like, when you're comparing the two types of data earlier, in the earlier slide, can you go back to slide? Data points, like, yeah, that one. So experiment 1 is independent, experiment 2 is both independent?
Oh, sorry. Experiment 1 is less social influence, experiment 2 is more social influence.
Yeah, more social influence. So when I think about social influence over time, I think there are two mechanisms. One is a positive feedback mechanism and the other is negative feedback mechanism. What I'm saying is, I mean, when people are interacting, they could be positive, like everyone loving the genre, the music, and then the other one is same homogeneous group, but more negative. So depending on which mechanism is going on, it can yield to different outcomes, right?
Yep.
So I think if that's what's happening, and the two mechanisms happening simultaneously, then you're going to get more variation in the outcome, right? Because one is leading to different, I mean, they are leading to different equilibrium. So I wonder whether you have some evidence for that from your data, or have you some speculations or some theories or findings in the data?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is the kinds of things that can happen here are relatively small. So people don't know who these other people are. So for example, a lot of the kinds of boomerang effects and identity effects, like, oh, we don't want to listen to the songs that those people listen to, that's not possible, because the only information you get is the aggregated download count. And then what we see, which I haven't shown you, is individuals are much more likely to listen to songs that are very popular. But then we don't see strong evidence that they are more likely to download a song when it is popular. So I have, in my mind, there's a relatively simple model of what is happening here, which is there's two decisions really, what you listen to and then the probability of download given listen. Most of the social influence happens in the first step, what you choose to listen to. Even though when people think about social influence in cultural markets, they often think about the second step. So that's what I think is happening. And subsequent to this, some people have built agent-based models that have a structure kind of like that structure that can reproduce the results of the experiment pretty well. So I'm just going to check the time because I want to make sure we have a break before our speaker. Okay? Katie?
That kind of covered.
Okay, good. So let me just say I've taught you all about how to do zero variable cost experiments, and then I just want to remind you of something about zero variable cost experiments. So imagine you got an email like this. Dear Professor Salganik, I'm writing you because I'm a prospective PhD student with considerable interest in your research. I would like to talk to you today. Sincerely, Carlos Lopez. So since many of us are social scientists, we might have a guess about what is going on here. This actually was not an email I received. It was part of an experiment about measuring discrimination. And so the goals here, I think, are very good to try to measure whether academics are more responsive to people with different characteristics and whether it varies as a function. So they have many different types of names, signaling, identity signaling with names. And then they also try to separate short-term versus long-term responsiveness. So in this email, it says, if you would be willing to meet today, and they have others that say, if you would be willing to meet in a week. So this has a lot of good zero variable cost properties, right? So sending out emails, basically free. Recruiting participants, you basically just scrape a bunch of websites. Randomization is free. Measuring the outcome is also pretty cheap because they just reply to you or they don't reply to you. So I want to be clear, though, about what are the costs in this experiment. So in the way that I've described it, I've only described the cost to me as the experimenter, right? So I've said, how long does it take me to get the email addresses? How long does it take me to send the emails? How long does it take me to track the responses? And there's an important group of people whose time is not being counted, and that is the participants, right? So there is a very important difference between zero variable cost and zero variable cost to you. If your experiment involves hijacking other people's time, that is a cost that you should include in how you think about your experiment. So I want to just be really clear about that. So in the music experiment, we were not hijacking their time. They came to listen to music. If you're going to do an experiment that involves hijacking people's time, then please be considerate of their time. I think in this particular study, they were pretty considerate. They're important research goals in the same way that audit studies of discrimination are important because of other problems with other techniques and so on. I think this study is a reasonable thing to do, but please be careful about using, thinking about the cost of everyone, not just for you. Yeah, Victoria?
How are you defining hijacking time? Because if somebody is spending time on your website and you're like seeing how long they spend on your website, like.
Sure. So what I mean by hijacking time is this person did not choose to be in this experiment. If I got this email, I have not opted in to participate in this study. So that is, I guess, what I mean. Whereas if you come to the music website, you're opting in to come and listen. Okay? So any questions about zero variable cost experiments? Yeah, Andrew?
I'm just wondering about the sort of
Yeah.
So when conducting an audit experiment, I'm wondering about the sort of relative position of the people that you may be contacting. So maybe an example here might be academics versus just elected officials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that I, for example, heard about this study was they contacted a lot of professors, and professors like to talk to each other. And so when professors found out they were in the study, some of them were unhappy because they said, I was a participant in this experiment and I wasn't compensated for my time. So I think you're right that I think it's when, as a practical matter, when you're doing experiments with participants who have a lot of power, you have to be careful. Ideally, we would be careful and respectful of all of our participants, which is what we should do. Maybe a good way of thinking about it is, would I do this experiment if the participants were powerful politicians or powerful professors or other things? And if the answer is no, then probably you shouldn't do it if it's other people. But yeah, I think as a practical matter, it's an issue who the people are that you're doing your research on. All right, so I'm gonna take a moment to bring the next speaker up and get the laptop connected. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back and hear Abdullah talk about high throughput experiments. Hi everyone, welcome back. On behalf of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you here, to everyone here in the room, to everyone at the partner locations, and everyone tuning in on the live stream. One of the great things about the Summer Institute is all of the people that we get to meet through organizing it. And so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce one of our alums to come and give a presentation. So Abdullah Almaatouq is starting in the fall, will be a professor at MIT in the Sloan School of Management. And he is also an alum from the 2017 program. So he's in the family. So the group project that he worked on in the second week has now been published. It was a paper about in-group identity and preference for Mechanical Turk workers. He also worked on the Fragile Families Challenge and then went back to MIT and formed a team of people that ended up winning on 3 of the 6 outcomes in the Fragile Families Challenge. And none of that had anything to do with his actual dissertation, which is what he's going to talk to us about more today. And one of the themes that we've talked about throughout the Summer Institute is about how changes in scale can open up new scientific possibilities. And I think Abdullah's work really illustrates that beautifully. And another thing that I love about his work is that in addition to doing this scientific research, you also have to solve a tool building problem. That is, to enable the kind of science we want to do, we have to sometimes build new tools. And so Abdullah and his colleagues and team have done a great job of creating an open source tool that allows other people to do the kind of work that they're doing. So he's not just building this tool and keeping it for himself, he's building this tool and making it available to everyone. And some of you, in fact, may be able to use it in your projects during the second week. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Abdullah Almaatouq.
Thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. As Matt mentioned, I actually participated in the 2017 Summer Institute. It was after the first year of my PhD, and it had a tremendous impact on shaping the rest of my experience as a graduate student, and it continues to shape my experience as a researcher, where I gained from this experience a lot of mentors, friends, and collaborators, and these categories are not mutually exclusive, but as well I got to participate in the Fragile Families Challenge. It inspired a lot of the work that I ended up doing in my PhD. I landed a really cool and great internship from that experience, and as well ended up getting a lot of support when I was on the job market last year from the network that I formed and from the support that I've got from the participants and the colleagues that I met in the Summer Institute. I was talking with Matt earlier, and he mentioned that I thought the 2017 version was amazing, and he's telling me that it's even getting better every year, so I can only tell you that I'm a bit jealous that I've done it that early on. Maybe I should have waited. But yeah, I'm sure that you will enjoy this, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm really grateful to be here and talk about, is experiments, and how can you run experiments at a scale that could qualitatively change the type of science that can be done. And I'm sure that Duncan already has talked, so this is not yet working. Yeah? And not the laptop either. No?
I don't know, somehow I thought if I press the forward button,
it will behave differently. So let's see.
All right, woohoo!
I'm not sure.
The clicker probably might not work.
And as
We've
well,
had trouble with our clicker.
and even the thing here. So it has to be clicking on the slide. Okay, sure, no problem.
Here we go.
So yeah, so I'm sure that by now, Matt has talked to you about why we should care about running experiments and as well different strategies for running those experiments. And central to my talk is one particular strategy, which is on building your own lab experiment. And this is a topic with a long history. I believe psychologists have been running lab experiments since the early 1930s. Social scientists have started running group experiments or group interaction experiments since the 1970s or 1960s. And we learned a great deal from those experiments because they provide tight control, high degrees of controlling the environment that the participants are in, but as well at the same time, they are optimized for causal inference and testing specific theories. And they don't look vastly different today from the 1960s, so actually maybe to comment on this. So these are pictures from, I pulled from a paper published in the 1969, I believe, about how to set up a lab for running group interaction experiments. And it's pretty fascinating what they actually have done with it, because it doesn't look vastly different today, how physical labs actually are designed. And functionally, they are pretty much the same and inherit a lot of the limitations and the criticisms that people have pointed out when it comes to running lab experiments. That is, again, most of the subjects are university, undergraduates, homogeneous population. There is very, the constraint on space means that you can have so many people at any particular point in time, so all group interactions have to remain small, and you end up with small sample size as well. You have as well interactions that are short-lived, and here I'm talking in particular for group experiments. The interactions have to be short-lived because there are so many hours you can trap undergraduate students in one place before it becomes unethical. And then because of the lab settings, you have to constrain yourself as a researcher to pretty simple and artificial tasks in unnatural settings that can affect their external validity or even their ecological validity. And overall, they are just extremely slow. They are very expensive, hard and difficult to set up. And then it's extremely hard as well to replicate. So if you think about all of these limitations that I've talked about, and you try kind of to roughly map them into these three dimensions of scale, the size, the complexity, and the richness of the environment, and as well duration, then these can define the design space of possible experiments. And then if we look at where the physical lab lies in that space, then you will find it somewhere pretty close to the origin. So you have these constraints that limits the design space of possible experiments that you could have. And then the idea of virtual labs, which is just using the web in order to relax some of these constraints. So when it comes by just relaxing the constraint of space, now you can have larger groups with large-scale interactions. You can have more sample size. You can have interactions that can last for longer. So when you think about something like the music lab, so it can actually last for a very long period of time. People don't have to be in one place trapped in order to perform the tasks. As well, you can have more real-time interactions. And as well, you have a more immersive environment that is representative of other digital environments that people are used to, and these results might generalize to, and as well gives you more precise instrumentation and ways of measuring actual behaviors. So with this kind of relaxation of these limitations, some people would say that using this virtual lab experiment paradigm can expand. This is my best way of representing how expanding something. It can expand the design space of possible experiments. So it's not just we can change the scale in terms of sample size, so we can run more of the same experiments or similar experiments, but we can run experiments that are qualitatively different from what we were able to run before. And this is all exciting, and it's kind of happening, but the reality of if we reflect on many of the studies that claim to be using this virtual lab approach and what they are doing, you'll find that there are actually many limitations and many challenges that are preventing them from taking advantage of that expanded design space. One thing that we see is that in virtual labs, a lot of the experiments are just physical lab experiments moved online. So they are not really leveraging any of these new capabilities other than running them on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is kind of another thing for another time, but as well the types of tasks, the nature of the tasks that they are running, the type of interactions and their durations remain the same to the ones that are run in the physical labs. And then when you want to do something else that actually goes beyond these simple experiments, so something like the music lab, because you've heard about it, or I think Matt did talk about it today, yeah? So something like the music lab, then it will actually require substantial programming experience. It's not actually easy to develop these things. Many researchers don't have necessarily the resources or the ability to program these things themselves. There are a lot of kind of knobs and things that have to be tweaked in order to get an digital infrastructure that allows you to run these experiments. So that's one thing. And when you delegate the development to undergraduate students, they don't necessarily understand how some of the design aspects that one has to carefully kind of administer when they are developing these experiments, or even professional developers who are unaware of some of the design decisions about experimentations, and they are sometimes hard to communicate, might create something that works, but is even internally invalid. So actually, I am saying this because I looked at some experiments that were developed by professional developers, and you'll find things about, for example, the assignment to treatments or the randomizations to be a little bit shady. They are working, but not really in ways that will resolve some of the constraints or the concerns that researchers have about arrival times and things like that, just because these professional developers don't necessarily understand why they are doing the randomization or what problem they are trying to solve. So that's kind of another challenge that is preventing people to really take advantage of these new opportunities. And another thing that is happening is that because of running a lot of these experiments that are similar to the ones that are run on the physical lab, some research actually have shown that you get less statistical power by running the same experiment online than in the physical lab, just because participants have less attention when they are online. You don't really have, like, you don't know who the participants really are. They can really easily get distracted and do other things. So even the effect sizes sometimes are smaller. So actually by having access to a larger pool and being to run the same or repeat the same experiments many times, you are only compensating kind of for the statistical power that you lost from running the experiment online. So what I want to argue for is that what we need is a different virtual lab paradigm that will really allow us to take advantage of this expanded design space. Right? Now, there are a lot of challenges. There is the opportunities. There is the promise of what virtual labs can deliver. But there are several constraints that are really preventing us from doing that. And actually, what I want to do to kind of to motivate and illustrate that, I want to talk a little bit about my substantive research. So I'm going to talk about collective intelligence. And this might seem for a couple of slides a little bit disconnected from running experiments online. But I promise you, you will see the relevance, and it will make some of the examples I'll give later a little bit more concrete. But as well, it's a chance for me to advertise my research, because what better place to actually get collaborators than to talk to you guys. So collective intelligence is just the idea that a group of individuals can outperform the average individual or even the best individual in the group when it comes to tasks like problem solving, prediction, forecasting, or estimation. And this is kind of, I think this is a very interesting problem, because these collective decision mechanisms or systems affect our lives in so many ways. From medical teams making life and death decisions, literally, to how markets function, where it provides this mechanism to aggregate private information and reach a consensus value, to how democratic systems work, where it aggregates differences in opinions in order to make a decision about who should lead us. And it's very hard to talk about these examples of collective intelligence without people also highlighting examples of collective failures. So people would say that this is evident by how we chose who to lead us, but as well market crashes, harmful and false rumors spread, and we've all been part of teams that are dysfunctional or were ineffective, which I'm sure none of you will experience next week, hopefully. But then one important question kind of in that research agenda became, what are the determinants or predictors of collective performance? How can we know whether a group will be wise or not? And sure, many people have asked that questions, and they come from different fields and from different domains and subfields, and different people would have different opinions and different theories about what matters for collective performance. And probably, so this is just like an unexhaustive list that I've encountered when I was doing the literature review part of my PhD. And surely all of these things seem to matter, maybe, probably under certain conditions. But then even if you select one of them and see what actually people think about it, so something like communication network, which is the flow of information or social influence, or how information can spread in that group, then you have many measures that actually can capture that communication network. So let's take one of them. So I'm trying to summarize kind of that entire literature unjustly in just a couple of slides. Then they choose a measure that characterizes the network, for example, efficiency. And efficiency is just something that captures how fast information can propagate on the network. And it's surely operationalized a little bit differently across different experiments, but it's kind of one measure that captures it is the average shortest path. So you just measure the shortest path between every individual in the network, and then you look at the average path. So if you look at that measure and see its relationship to collective performance, you'll find that actually there is experimental evidence that as you increase the efficiency of the network, then you increase collective performance. And actually this is kind of, it seems kind of intuitive, and as well, there are multiple explanations there by the different papers. One would say that it makes sense because as you increase efficiency, then good solutions can spread quicker, and then people can actually find good regions in the solution space to actually converge to, and then they end up with having higher performance. So the speed of information propagation is positively correlated or associated with, in these experiments, to group performance. Another explanation is that these efficient networks, they tend to be decentralized. So everyone's initial belief is equally weighted. So it actually represents some sort of a democratic process. And then if people are in this, beliefs are equally weighted and you have idiosyncratic errors, then they will cancel out and then you will converge at the truth. So these two explanations for why efficiency should actually increase collective performance. But then simultaneously, you have other experimental evidence that finds exactly the opposite result, where they tell you that actually if you increase the efficiency, then you actually reduce collective performance. And although these results seem a little bit counterintuitive, they actually have a plausible explanation. One is that as you increase the efficiency, the group or the crowd can converge prematurely to a solution, to a local optima, so they don't get to actually explore enough, and they converge very quickly in their opinions, and then they might converge on suboptimal solution, and that's why they wouldn't actually do well. And a little bit of inefficiency will actually increase the level of exploration and the propagation of information, so you will end up with even a better solution. So while all of these experimental results that are run using some sort of virtual labs, they make sense in isolation. When you look at them collectively, then what you've learned is that efficiency can improve or reduce collective performance. And this is not only about that one particular measure and that one particular thing that people think matters. But if you look at anything in this list, this is kind of how the literature would look like. Whether the ability of the skill members matter is something that you will find experimental evidence that can go in different directions, their social perceptiveness, skill diversity, and you get the idea. So I spent a big chunk of my PhD time just being confused, trying to kind of know what my contribution should be, and at the same time trying to synthesize or understand what's going on. And I can only imagine that if someone would want to use the experimental scientific evidence to design a policy in the real world or in organizations or in communities to make teams and collectives perform better and improve, they will be as well rightly confused, because anything they choose, they'll find an evidence that this is the best thing that they could have done or the worst thing. And without getting into so much details of this one, which is kind of a whole chapter in the thesis to make the formalism of the language, one argument that I make is that one of the reasons of these inconsistencies exist in the literature, and we surely can talk about many other reasons that can lead to that, is that people choose implicit parameters about their experiment that interact with their treatment and don't think that they matter much, that can actually affect the results and reverse it. And to make that more concrete kind of conceptually, without getting into any of the technical details, usually when you think about an experiment and you decide that you want to run a lab experiment, the first thing that you think about is the theory that you have and then treatments. What are the treatments? What are the variables that you want to manipulate? And then maybe you'll have like 2 treatments, a control and another treatment, or like whatever number of treatments that you have in order to test the theory that you have in mind. Then when you go actually and you want to operationalize your experiment, you end up with a bunch of other decisions that you have to make. So if we think in the context of the music lab experiment, then the treatments are whether there is social influence or not. And then the outcome is the predictability of these cultural marketplaces. And when you go and operationalize that experiment, you have to make many other decisions, which is how many songs to include. That is a parameter of that actually you have to operationalize in order to study the things that you care about, although you might not care much about how many songs exist in your platform. When you are thinking of the context of the treatments here, 2 different network structures in terms of communication patterns, then the difficulty of the task or the type of task that individuals are doing, the proportion of expertise, the payoff, when you are thinking about, for example, network structures, and I was talking with Sarah, and cooperation levels, for example. So whenever you have to actually go and build the experiment, you end up with many choices and decisions and parameters that you have to choose. And let me show you kind of an illustration of what that means. So once you actually, let's assume that you have 2 parameters that you care about, and you have 2 treatments. So the 2 parameters could be in the music lab experiment, the number of songs, that's your X, that's parameter 1, and another one, how salient the social signal is. Or when, for the example I gave on networks, it could be the difficulty of the task and the proportion of experts in the population, for example. Once you actually choose your treatment, you form these regions in the parameter space. So some technical term that some people use is these feasibility domains, which are just regions, these parameter values, under which your treatment will be effective. So if you choose this number of songs with this saliency of social signals, then you will find the effect that you are looking for under these parameters or under these conditions. And once you choose another network structure, so let's talk about networks. So you choose the efficient network, and then you choose a more inefficient network. Then you form another region in the parameter space, in these 2 parameters, where you'll find that the second network will actually promote the desired behavior or the behavior that you are looking for. So in this case would be collective intelligence or wisdom of the crowd. So if you choose a value of the parameters that are inside these colored regions, you'll find that one network is better than the other. So what then happens is that the first group or researcher runs their first experiment. So what they care about is network structures. So they have these two treatments. They manipulate that, but then they have to operationalize all of these other things. They do, and then they run that experiment, which is that one point in the parameter space. And then they conclude that network A is, or network 1 is better than network 2, because network 1 can promote collective intelligence, while network 2 doesn't. And this might sound like an intuitive result to the editors and reviewers, but it's about networks, so it's still nice. So it gets published in some decent venue. Then this other research group runs a similar experiment, and then they find the opposite results. And this result is now a little bit more counterintuitive, and they get to say that everyone says X, but we actually show Y. And it's about networks, so this is really kind of interesting. So it gets published in a really fancy journal. And then a third experimenter will run an experiment and say, you know what? Network structure does not matter for collective intelligence. Like, we run this experiment, we manipulated network structures, it's just not related. And this is something that no one really wants to hear. So at best, it will end up on archive. And that last one is actually a true story, just saying. So this is actually reminds me of the story of the blind monks and the elephant. So the story goes, I'm sure many of you have heard, they encounter an elephant for the very first time, and they try to conceptualize or understand what an elephant is. So these monks touch different regions of that elephant, and the one that's touching the trunk will end up saying that, oh, an elephant is something that looks like a snake. The one who's touching the tail will say it looks like a rope. The one who's touching the leg would say it's like a pillar. And they would think that there is like ill intentions from the others, or they are cheating or doing something wrong. And it's only, and no matter how many times, so it's not a problem of replications, no matter how many times you touch, you end up with the same conclusion as long as you are touching the same region. And it's only when you try to put these things together or touch different regions until you actually really understand and be able to conceptualize what an elephant is. So when I talk about virtual lab experiments, I'm not talking about really just running more of the same experiments. What I envision is something that goes like this. So you have this thing that really reduces the cost of running experiments, of explicitly defining what the parameters are, and it gives you all of these wonderful things, which is the web. But then when you run your experiment, you should actually understand that results that you found are under particular conditions of your experiments, of the environment that you put your participants in. And then that process, although the running of the experiment itself has been automated with the web, so you can be asleep and collect data about the condition that you pre-specified. What is not automated is which conditions should we run. So can actually the thing is, the virtual lab itself runs an experiment while you're asleep, and before you wake up, it processes that samples and decides what the follow-up experiment should be if we want to maximize or optimize our understanding. So that means that the virtual lab platform has to take in the results of that running experiment, see what are the conditions that these results were found, and then it should suggest to the researcher what is the next experiment that you should run in order to break your results. Not necessarily to break your results, but actually to efficiently explore that parameter space, what is the best other region that you should touch if you want to actually see to what extent your results are true, or how the qualitative behavior can change under different conditions. So it's like this dependence on context. And then you can go back and forth such that you can efficiently, either yourself or across different research teams, be able to kind of explore that parameter space and then ask different type of questions about the phenomena that you are interested in. So for example, if you talk about about a particular organization, then the question is, in which part of this parameter space is relevant to my organization, because those experiments will be relevant to my intervention. If my organization is of a particular size with a particular type of task and individuals, then I'm not necessarily interested about results that are true under very different conditions. And the other thing that you can as well learn from this are what are the promising regions in the parameter space that are worth applying and designing in the real world, which kind of it's more of like a social technology, or what the organizations or companies are interested in, which is I don't necessarily want just to understand what people are doing and the settings that I have and what different interventions would work, but what would be the best context to put these individuals in to make the best decisions in the context of collective performance. So to that end, and please feel free to ask me any questions at any point. Maybe I said this a little bit late in the presentation, but as well, if there is anything that you want us to talk about more, I'm happy to do so, and we can as well talk more about other things after the presentation. So kind of to this end, and as we said, this is actually just running experiment is difficult, and kind of running experiments where it allows you to automate the process of selecting and exploring the parameter space and the different conditions and the different parameters that you should look at is even going to be more technically challenging. We built Empirica, the platform that Matt mentioned. And actually, I started with Empirica when kind of, to give a little bit of context, my background is more of like computer science and applied mathematics, and I started to do a little bit more theoretical work on the things that I'm interested in, but then I really got interested in experiments, and I had to build an experiment, and then kind of see that there aren't many tools, and although I'm kind of considered a computer scientist, it is not easy to build an experiment because of all of the edge cases and all of the things and moving parts that one have to consider. So I kind of started that before, at the beginning of my PhD, like building something for myself that I can just to run this one experiment that kind of corresponds to my one model. And it just took so much time that I knew that if a reviewer asks for another condition, that's the rest of my PhD, right? I will be only able to run 2 experiments. So when I actually joined the Summer Institute and I had the chance to see things like wiki surveys and talk kind of with the people who were kind of doing similar things, it motivated me to actually build an open source platform of this and have other people contribute to the project. So we called it Empirica, and it does 2 main things. One that I think is unique to Empirica, and another is more shared with other platforms that claim to be doing virtual lab things. So the more unique thing is that, or let me maybe start with the thing that is common with other platforms. So it's an open source full framework that allows you to reduce the cost and the effort you need to run group online experiments with real-time interaction. So it makes it extremely easy to run these types of experiments in real time, as well as asynchronous and sequential experiments on networks or on not, if people have to be working simultaneously or arriving sequentially, like the music lab, building prediction markets and all of these things, and at the same time provide a well-developed API and backend that does a lot of the things that researchers care about, but they don't want to develop, like randomization across conditions, designing the space of conditions that they care about, dealing with disconnections, dropout, recruitment, and all of these other things. The unique thing about it, I think, is that it forces the researcher, or well, let me not say force, it encourages the researcher to actually be explicit about all of the choices that they are making while they are developing the experiment. So while you are not maybe interested in varying all of these variables, and I wouldn't encourage you to do so, because you can see that with a simple experiment, so this is actually an interface for an experiment that we run, and the thing that we care about is a static versus a dynamic network. So people get to rewire, or they don't choose who their neighbors are. But we actually had to make all of these other decisions in order to run our experiments. So what is the size of the network? What is the rewiring frequency? What is the type of feedback that they see? What is the communication format they have? How many neighbors would they have? All of these things we had to make decisions about. And then what the platform is making us do is that you have to make that explicitly, like these are decisions that could have varied, but you're keeping constant in your experiment. Then you get to design your treatment out of that space of possible experiments, and you can see that it kind of the size of possible experiments explode, and you're maybe only based on your theory you're interested in one element. So you get to actually say that this is the thing that I want to vary. These are the things that I say they don't matter, but I have to operationalize, or they don't matter for my theory. And this actually allows researchers to collaborate. So one thing that we are trying to do is to actually work with other researchers who are interested in the same outcome, so team performance, but they think different things matter. And then what we tell them is that, you know what, you take this, you go and vary the things that you think matter, I'll go and vary the things that I think matter. So we are exploring different regions in the parameter space, but at least I know how many changes do I have to make to go from my experiment into exactly your experiment? And actually have estimates that are comparable with each other and makes a meta-analysis or synthesis of these results more attainable and more useful. So that's kind of I think the unique thing about the platform. But then you get to actually, there is kind of an admin UI component to it, which masks a lot of the complexity about, oh, do I need a lobby where I have people to wait so they start playing the game or the experiment together, or do I want them to arrive sequentially? And as well, the logic that you can have in there. Like what happens if you don't get the number of people you want? Do we want us to start anyway? Do you want us to form smaller teams? Do you want us just to cancel the experiment? You get like to specify all of these kind of nitty-gritty kind of logic that you would need to code just by providing the researcher with an interface. Also, it provides a lot of the procedural control about your randomization in a well-tested way, so you can decide what type of randomization would you want to have, and as well the parameters of your randomizations, and it will be implemented for you. So really, all you have to do is to think of the experiment from the perspective of one condition, from the perspective of one participant, and develop it, and then it will work for all participants in all conditions, and you don't have to think about checking if these two participants are in the same world, in the same treatment, or they are in a different one. It just will work. Whenever you are talking about it, you are talking about the same thing. So it's scoped kind of correctly. Kind of to maintain flexibility of, we wanted people to actually, so one thing we do when we started working with Empirica is to go to people who want to run experiments and tell them, what is the optimal experiment that you want to run? Because one thing that we noticed when you meet with people who have interest in running these experiments, who have backgrounds that are not necessarily in computer sciencey fields, let's say, they sometimes change the optimal, so they have the optimal design to test the thing that they want to test, but then because they know that they want to use Qualtrics or like O3 or something like that, they have to compromise what the experiment is in order to something that these tools can accommodate. So one thing that we do is we go to them and tell them, you know what? Tell us what is the optimal experiment that you want to develop. Don't worry about the technology or the feasibility of implementing it. What is the best way to answer the question that you want to answer? And then we kept doing that exercise as we were developing Empirica and the API at the beginning, because one thing we wanted to do is that it's not only allowing us to run the type of experiments that we want to run, and then people ending up needing to change the type of experiments they run in order to fit to the framework, but to make it flexible enough such that it can accommodate very different types of experiments. So synchronous, asynchronous, prediction market types of experiments, networked experiments, single individual experiments, experiments that are happening over long horizons of time. So experiment that can run for a month continuously, but kind of asynchronous, or an experiment that happen only like for 10 minutes. And we had like to able to be accommodate that. So one thing that made us do, which is to have a programming component to it. So it's not fully UI configurable, but you actually have to do something. So you have an API that actually determines what happens at different points in the game, and you just get and set value to different objects. It's all in the tutorial and in the online website. I thought it wouldn't be really useful like to go into these things if people haven't seen JavaScript before, but it's just like getting and setting values into objects, and then it will work. You don't care about, is this value synchronized across all people who are in the same condition in the same world? It will just work. And whenever you say that I want to do something at this particular stage or round, it's the current stage or round. You don't have to check which stage you are in or what round. So it's really reducing the number of queries that you have to run, and things will just work in the back end. So there are several examples. So we have community demos section on the Empirica website where the experiments that we developed and other people have developed. One thing that we ask, so at the beginning, and we still do, so this is a chance for people who want to use it for next week, is that we help people to actually develop their experiment, and all we ask in return is to make their code publicly available in the as a community demo. So whatever, and it doesn't have to be right away. So some people are concerned about like publication and things like that. Upon publication, they have to make their experiment online, and in return, we will actually help you and make sure that you deliver the best experiment that you want to deliver to your participants. So there are, on the community website, you'll find several, from actually interactions between human and AI. So actually you can embed artificial actors and algorithms to actually interact with individuals and measure things about them and manipulate things very easily, to more traditional kind of psychology type of experiments, but this time done in groups, as well more kind of complicated tasks where people get to chat and they get to solve these constraint satisfaction and optimization problems and manipulating things about the environment, like the difficulty of the task, the type of individuals and things like that they are in the group, and many other forecasting, prediction market type of tasks. There are several papers now. So actually Empirica really was kind of in beta a year and a half ago, and we were really glad to see that there are some papers that are already published. There are other papers that are under review, and many more examples you will find on the website. And surely, I have to say, I guess, that there are other tools out there other than Empirica, to be fair, that we learned a lot from, and they are worth mentioning here. So if you think Empirica is not the right thing, there are these other ones. But according to this figure with fake data that I made, we're the best. So you have that. And there are so many things, actually, that you can do. So that's people sometimes ask me, like, OK, this is really cool. How can we get started? So you can help us actually by, if you feel adventurous, to actually build your experiment on Empirica for next week, if that's something that you are going to do. And we'll be more than happy to actually help you through it and have something functional, hopefully before the end of the week with data. As well, if you think that, experiments are not my thing, I don't believe in experiments, I will never run any, then you can maybe tell your colleagues who run experiments about the platform, because actually there is this network effect on this platform. The more we have examples and the more we have people from different fields running their experiments on the platform, the more appealing it is, the easier it is for others to use, because they have all of these examples that they can copy parts of the code, and it's very modular, so they can like combine different experiments and create new ones. But as well, this gets me kind of to the financial model that we are using to sustain this platform, which is if you say, you know what, this is cool, but I don't think it's worth my time to actually learn anything about JavaScript, no matter how easy your platform makes it to do my experiment. We have a network of professional developers who actually have developed Empirica experiments in the past and know how to talk with researchers and how to run experiments, so they can develop experiments for quite, I would say, cheap hourly rate, very sophisticated experiments very quickly. And those are the same developers who are developing the core of Empirica. So they are we're trying to create an incentive for them to continue to develop the open source project, to bring more people in to do that. But we are reaching a point where we actually need more financial support to sustain some of the activities that we are doing, and to keep up with the demand and as more people are using the platform to actually resolve issues in GitHub and things like that. So if you have any ideas or thoughts or anything, you always can as well come and help us with that. And finally, if you just want to talk about it, you're a designer, you're a programmer, and you want to contribute to the project, you think we have features that are missing or conceptual things that we actually have to include, we're always happy to talk to everyone and really have them on board in the team and actually work on this. And we can invite you to the Slack channel where we are doing a lot of these things. So thank you very much. I hope I motivated some of you to consider using it. And if you want to talk about collective intelligence or experiments, I'm here for the rest of the day to do that. Thank you. So let's go like this.
All right, thanks. This is really cool. This seems like a really great platform for exploring the parameter space, as you're saying, and like So implicit in the idea of the collective intelligence stuff is this idea of these nonlinearities between the parameters, because if it was easy to model them linearly, we wouldn't have to explore the whole space like this, right? So I'm worried, though, about when it comes time to, because when people are trying to apply this knowledge that you're generating, it almost certainly won't be on this platform, right? They're going to do it in different contexts. And so the real world is itself infinitely high parameter. And so in a context in which you're worried about nonlinearities between the parameter space, are you concerned about people doing everything on this platform, essentially overfitting to this platform, and then decreasing out-of-sample performance to parameters that vary off this platform? Like in the real world, like it's hot or cold in the room.
Yeah. No, I think this is a great question. Should I repeat the questions for the online people, or do they hear it already from the microphone? Okay, so basically, in short, the question is, what if the real-world parameter values don't directly necessarily map, or let's say, maybe this is a fair way to say it, to the parameters that you choose in your experiment? And I think this is a fair question, and to be taken seriously when developing lab experiments, that the results that come out of these experiments not to be taken literally. But actually, all of these regions in the parameter space is to be kind of understood in this comparative static way, where you say, you know what, for example, I would expect, like in the music lab, potentially the number of songs matter on how predictable the market is in terms of hits. And then they ran an experiment with, I don't remember, was it 48? Yeah, so like with 48 songs, and they found, for example, with a particular way of making the social signal salient, but then does that mean, and then maybe you run it with a smaller number of songs and you find that it becomes really predictable, a larger number of songs, like there is an interaction between as well, like how salient the information is and what the size of the choice set is. And what you should learn from that experiment is kind of the qualitative behavior that when the number of songs is small or change, it can qualitatively change the behavior of your cultural market. And not to take the number 48 to be literal or exact, which is the boundary condition under which if you pass, then you have this phase transition and you end up in a different regime. So it's not to be taken like that, and I don't think even you can. One thing you're absolutely right about is that sometimes the parameters we care about in the real world are hard to measure. You can't even measure them in order to be able to map them to where they are in these experiments. And the second thing, they change. So things in the real world change over time, while kind of this thing has a more of a static view to things. And this is actually relevant to my own research in collective intelligence, which is trying to use these experiments to test mechanisms that can promote collective intelligence in non-stationary environments, because we don't know what is the region we care about. We don't know exactly what is the parameters we care about in the real world. So let's forget about what these values really are, because they change by the time that you figure out what they are. And how can we provide things or mechanisms or tools to those individuals such that they can themselves change so it's adaptive kind of a treatment. So they change what the structure look like such that it's adaptive to whatever environment they are in. And usually these environments as well very high dimensional. So even individuals don't know what environment and context and parameters values they are in, but they get some noisy signals about that. So how can we deal with it? So I think these are the kind of the two answers. One is to kind of recognize that and maybe change the type of questions that people ask. And the second thing, for these experiments, you can learn a lot from them, but they don't, maybe that's more of an opinion thing. They shouldn't be taken literally, but more in a comparative static way. And then we can go to you, Yuan, and then to you there. Okay, go ahead. Hi.
Thanks for a great talk.
Can you please mention your name? And before, sorry, your name, so I just know. Kevin.
I'm Monica. Thanks for a great talk and for creating this tool. I really look forward to trying it out in my own experiments. I have two questions. So one is about dropout rates.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if you're in the lab, that it's really unlikely that one of participants will just stand up and just leave the lab. And if you have like experiments involving group interaction in groups of 3, 4, or 5 people, if someone drops out after half an hour, I mean, it's just really wasted. the whole like half an hour is just wasted for other participants and for you as the experimenter. And I was wondering how you deal with that. And the second question is about creating group identity when you run like group experiments in virtual labs. Because my impression is that it's easier to create group identity if you have people in like the physical lab, and it will be much harder to do it in online environment. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts, and maybe you have some suggestions how to deal with that.
Sure. Let me talk about, so the first one is about dropout. And this is an interesting and it's difficult to have a clear-cut answer to it because it depends, right? So sometimes, so even if you want to generalize your results to a platform, so you want to create a virtual lab that looks like Twitter, for example, so like a platform where it's like a microblogging platform or something like that, and you want to have full control and use, like have participants be there necessarily maybe for a full day or maybe for longer, and then you will have different, like you have dropout rates, right? And that's actually something that maybe is relevant to your experiment because your outcome is what is the dropout rate. So it's not an issue, it's not a bug in that type of an experiment, but it's something that you want to do, like you want to study and under which conditions the dropout rate will go up or down. So how can we actually have people more engaged in this? The other thing is dropout rates when you don't desire it. And this is kind of, I think it happens more often online for different things because as you don't have the physical thing, you can trap them for an hour and just have them do it. They get kind of the leader of doing it on their own time. And they might drop out, and I think that would definitely correlate with how boring the task is. Could be. And this is kind of an incentive for researchers to create more interesting, engaging tasks, potentially. But then as well, what does a dropout mean? Would mean different things based on the context. So if dropout is random, so people disconnect, machines just freeze, and they just like drop out from experiments, and it's independent of the treatment of your group interaction thing, then you might not really care about you wouldn't care much about this dropout because it's happening random and maybe it's equal across treatment or something like that. So maybe it's not having a big effect. But actually, if the dropout is a function of the treatment, so some conditions are more boring and people are more frustrated. So actually, this is something that happened to us. So we had people come into an experiment. They did some tasks individually, and we measure many things about them, like their social perceptiveness, their ability in the task, their cognitive style, like how do they solve the problem, and we study all of that behaviorally. And then we bring them back, and we put them in teams with different compositions. So we put people with different cognitive styles, or the same cognitive style, the same skill, or variance in skill, and things like that. And one thing we found that if you have people with low social perceptiveness teams, then people were less happy about their team members, especially when they had like low skills, and there was higher dropout rate that we actually had to deal with it. And you can imagine that actually by creating sometimes a treatment that creates a special experience that increases the rage or the number of people who drop out can affect the results, but at the same time, in this case, we found it to be interesting too, which is kind of people quitting and saying, you know what, you continue doing the experiment, I don't want to get the payoff, right? So that's kind of, and that might actually happen in real teams who are not working well. So that's the question about the dropout. The second question was?
Group identity.
Group identity. So this, I wouldn't be the best person to answer that question. Some maybe more like social psychologists who study group identity will have better idea. I know of some work, including a little bit of mine, that says the contrary. It's actually very easy to create group identities on kind of things that are not very salient. And the paper that Matt mentioned, which was my project for the Summer Institute, was to show that there is, if you actually have people play a dictator game and you have workers who are all from Untitled, from the same crowdsourcing platform, or someone from Untitled and someone from Crowdflower or from some other platform, or a crowd worker with someone else random in the world, the cooperation levels will actually decrease as you make kind of the identity, as you change identities of the partners. So that's kind of, maybe that's not a good enough answer to say that actually it's as salient, but I'm sure I've seen some research on guilds and online games and like in-group bias and things like that manifesting themselves to a high degree there that could be comparable to a physical lab setting, but I wouldn't be able to actually give you a really good empirical answer or reflection on that. Cool. So maybe one.
Thanks for the great talk. I just wondering the challenges of specified parameters. Like if we want to measure the difficulty, we may have different dimensions. Like some text needs more like patience, some need more like, for example, some special skills. So it's really, I feel like it's really hard to specify the most useful parameters. And also the other thing is that there might be some unobserved variables that are equally important, like the time. Maybe the same text that was done yesterday will have a different outcome than today. So I know it could be very challenging, but
yeah, no, this is a great question, and I think there are maybe at least two ways I can think of that can kind of get at it. One is, how do you specify the parameters that actually matter? Like there are parameters, and actually you always can ignore something that someone else thinks is important, right? And that usually appears during the review process. What about this thing? And then what we are trying to solve it at least in two ways. One is to actually organize a workshop with people who are interested in the same outcome from different fields, and just say, what are the theories that you have about collective performance? Let's take the union of all of the things that we think matter. So we are like 4 or 5 different teams from different fields. Let's take the union of that. Let's define that as the parameter space that we start exploring. But then there is always the opportunity for someone to come and say, you forgot that one. And actually it happened in our case, which is we thought that everything that we chose, we specified as a parameter. But then someone came in and said, you didn't specify the social communication format. Now you show them the answer of the others, but what if you add a chat instead? And then that's not a parameter. So what is the choice of like communication format? What this platform allows you to do is that to go and add a new factor. So you say, okay, you'll take my experiment, and you say you're missing that thing. If we're missing it, that means we operationalized it, but and had some value for it. We just didn't specify it as a parameter. And then you say that, okay, it's communication format. In your case, it's numerical. That's what you chose as default. But I'll add that factor, and I'll add the option of face-to-face interaction or a video interaction and a chat box. And then you add that, and then this gets pushed to everyone who's actually running that. So you can cumulatively add more parameters. But then you are asking that, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is the best thing to do, or even to agree on what the parameters are in the beginning, but it's kind of, it allows for what you mentioned, which is there is kind of unknown variables. And I think that should be addressed, or that's the part of the goal of theory. So theory actually tells us what parameters we should care about. And if there is a theory that why this thing should happen differently today, or like on Saturday, that on a weekday, then that theory should inform which parameters to actually include. And if you say that there are things that are weird that are happening, that you are seeing in the experiment of inconsistencies that might be interacting or being conditioned on these unobserved parameter, then it will be the role of theory to actually tell what parameter it is. For maybe it's, the color of the avatars that people have, or the color of the payment they get, or something like that, the theory of color and its effect, in order to be included in this framework. And that would be one way kind of to address that, maybe.
I'm not quite understand how the tool relates to the high dimension of the hypothesis, or the high dimension of the hypothesis or the parameters, like.
So repeat the question from the beginning. I didn't hear the first part.
I'm not quite understand how the tool relates to the high dimensionality. How your tool relates to the. Is it about the declaring part, or?
So I'll tell you what it allows, the tool. The tool allows the automation of selection of conditions. So you can say that I want to run this experiment on a group, so it's kind of just one trial, or 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, and have a condition or a program that tells it what is the next condition that it should run. So for example, assume that you have like multiple arms, you have multiple treatments, and what you say, I want to like run enough of these experiments until these two things are different, and then I want to stop running this experiment because I'm already learned that this treatment is not good. I want to now sample another treatment. So it's kind of, it allows you to sample from the parameter space in whatever way that you want. One way that we are doing that, so it's kind of providing the ability to do that. And then you can do it you can do it manually. You can do it some algorithmically of what treatments to run next. One thing that we are trying to do now is kind of to do it algorithmically, to do it in a distributed way. So different people are running their own experiments that they are interested in. All of that is being fed back to an kind of a learning algorithm that's trying to estimate what are the promising regions in the parameter space, and then suggesting to the researchers, oh, maybe you should stop changing how many participants are there, like the group size, because we kind of learned what that does. It's more interesting to run this condition where you vary this other thing, where we have not enough data to actually say anything about. So it's kind of having a more of like a reinforcement algorithm there that's sitting at the back and looking at the results of different experiments that are in different regions and telling them or suggesting. And then, because some treatments, sometimes they don't make sense. Like there are some treatments, some combinations of factors that you just don't care about. And actually this goes back into evaluating the significance of some of the interesting or surprising results in the literature. Because sometimes you find results that are counterintuitive, but then they are true under very narrow region in the parameter space. So like they are very specific conditions under which this counterintuitive result is true, and it's unrelated to the things that we care about in the real world. And so how significant that result is. It is surprising, but it's irrelevant, which is different from a result that is surprising and important because it's actually in a region that we care about. So kind of the mapping and the exploration, the tool doesn't tell you how to do it, but it's providing hooks that allows you to experiment with different ways of doing it.
First of all, I'm really fascinated by your project. I think it's really great. It kind of helped me to recover my faith in the use of experiments in social sciences, because I'm doing mostly interested in testing sociological theories, like the individual human behavior. So it's really great. But my question is about like how I can manipulate environmental variable if I'm doing experiment on your platform.
If you are doing
environmental variable,
individual level,
the impact of environmental variable on the agents in the if I'm doing experiment on your platform. So the question I'm thinking about is if I'm thinking there could be bidirectional interaction between environmental variable and agents. It's not only environmental affecting the agents, but also agents can shape the characteristics of the environmental variable. So it's like feedback effect is going on. Is there any way in which I can do that on your platform?
So it's actually, have we done that? Or is there an experiment that did that? So I can see how that can be done on Empirica. I'm not sure that if someone has done it, because once you are actually in the environment as an experiment designer, you have access to all of the parameters of the environment from within the interface of the tool. So one thing you can say that, if the agent takes this action, then this parameter should change. So the treatment should actually change for the next period or for the next time that they are doing the task. Is that answering the question? I'm not sure that I understood the question correctly, which is the question that what if you want to have an interaction between the individual and the environment? So kind of individuals are shaping their environment, and then the environment in return is kind of maybe shaping the decision-making process or the actions of the agent. And if that is the question? Okay, so yeah, it is enabled. You could do that. Like if we sit together, maybe I can like show you where these things should go in order for us to enable that. This is a very interesting design that I don't think people have done it. What people have done is these kind of within subject design, where they have people and then they do they are in one condition, and then at some point in the experiment, they are moved into another condition, and these are pre-specified. But if you want to dynamically decide what the next treatment should be, it is possible to do that. Is it?
We have a question from the live stream coming from Mexico. Alejandro first says, congratulations on the platform. Second, he asks, is there a way we can configure the language shown to participants, or does the platform work entirely in English?
Ooh. So there is so when you think about the of Empirica, you can think of three different actors interacting with it. One is the experiment designer. It's the one who's conceptualizing what the experiment look like. And this is maybe the PI or like the graduate student who's working on this experiment. And they are provided with a UI that allows them to control a lot of the things about the experiment. And requires no programming. And this UI is in English. So it's like how to assign treatments, the lobby, how is it within subject, like all of these different decisions. The parameters, all of these are defined from an interface that is supposed to be working with or worked by the designer of the experiment. Then there is the experiment developer, which is the one who's touching the code. And that's in JavaScript. And in that case, it's the one who's responsible for a little bit of filling the functions that I've shown before, like the methods, to dealing with the API, but as well with components of the UI that will be presented to the user. And that can be in any language. It's kind of a string. It's like an HTML, CSS, using React, and we have like our own libraries for things that are usually used like for, that researchers are interested in, like a timer or something like that. And that's just like regular UI, you can do any language for the participants to do that. And then you have the participants and the experiments, which will actually interact with that interface using the logic that is determined by the experiment designer. So it's kind of, it goes back and forth. So the question is, can I run it with participants who are non-English speakers? If you develop your experiments where the components in the UI are not in English, that will be fine. I think actually we have an experiment in German by some people in Max Planck, so that's an example of that. Okay, I guess that's it. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Let's thank Abdullah.